Have you ever imagined waiting 3 decades just to tear a life apart? To take from someone the very thing they thought would protect them? I waited 30 years to destroy the man who protected the woman who beat me. My name is Sarah Mitchell. I am 57 years old. For 30 years, I lived with a lie that the people who should have protected me had chosen to hurt me instead. This is the story of how I quietly, patiently, and finally destroyed the man who stood by while my mother broke me. If you've ever dreamed of seeing someone finally get what they deserve, smash that like button and subscribe. And tell me in the comments from where you are watching. I want to know how far this story is reaching. Because today's story, it's about patience, justice, and the kind of revenge that makes your skin tingle. If you hear one thing from me tonight, hear this. I killed a man's security not with a knife but with paperwork. I destroyed the scaffolding he stood on for 40 years. I made the person who sheltered a monster realize he'd been sheltering death all along. It took 30 years, perfect timing, and a patience that became my second skeleton, and I savored every single second of the waiting. You think revenge is ugly? A messy, bloody business? Stick around. This one was surgical. The house at 47 Willow Road was not a home. It was a mouth that never closed, that breathed hot and sour, exhaling a miasma of cheap tobacco, chemical bleach, and that faint, metallic sweetness of old blood that always seemed to linger in the air after my mother's fits. It was the scent of a wound that never heals, covered daily with a frantic, fragrant disinfectant. I can still feel the gritty texture of white paint flaking under my fingernails. Not from creating art, but from scrubbing the wall where a plate of spaghetti, or was it a glass ashtray, had exploded against the floral wallpaper. Childhood memory isn't chronological for me. It's a collection of sensory imprints, the weight of the broom handle pressed against my bruised ribs as I swept up shards of a life I never chose. The way the late afternoon light in the kitchen would bend, distorting through the prism of my tears when her hand swung. The specific hollow thud in my chest that echoed the sound of the front door clattering shut at 5:15 p.m., signaling Robert's return. He'd come home smelling of diesel oil from the bus depot, of other people's cheap cologne, and underneath it all, the faint, sour odor of someone else's pity. My mother, Linda, was a virtuoso of small cruelties. She didn't just get angry. She conducted her rage with the precision of a symphony conductor. She had a scientist's eye for measuring humiliation. It was in the specific tilt of her head when she found a flaw in your appearance, the calculated pause before she delivered a compliment that was really a condemnation. That color almost makes you look healthy, Sarah, she'd say, her eyes scanning me for the flinch. When she lost control, it was never a chaotic explosion. It was methodical, almost graceful. She delivered violence like she served tea, deliberate, scalding hot, and always, always to order. And then there was Robert, my stepfather, weakness incarnate. His devotion to Linda was not the fierce passion of a lover, but the passive, desperate reliance of a plant starving for sunlight. He was a bus mechanic, a man who could diagnose the misfire in a diesel engine from 20 feet away, but was willfully deaf to the misfearing heart of his own household. He fixed other people's transports while his own family's vehicle careened off a cliff. He had a loud, booming laugh for his coworkers, a ready joke for the corner shopkeeper, but for home, he reserved a silence so profound it became a third presence in the room. He was the enabler, the shield. But the shield was made of rust and cobwebs, and it shattered at the first sign of real conflict. I don't just say I was terrified. Let me show you what terror felt like in that house. It was a physical thing. My stomach would curl into a small, hard ball of lead. My fingernails would split, not from biting, but from pressing them into the seams of my bed sheets, holding on for dear life in the dead of night. I became a scholar of safety, learning its cadence by heart. Make no sudden noises after 6 p.m., laugh exactly 3 seconds after she did, echo whatever hollow compliment she lobbed like a trained parrot. Survival was a daily, desperate improvisation. It was the summer of 1981. I was 13, all sharp elbows and nervous energy, possessing the haphazard bravery of a child who still, somewhere deep down, believed adults were infallible. The air was thick with the tinny sound of a Madonna song drifting from a neighbor's radio. I was looking for a missing hair ribbon. and the top drawer of Robert's dresser was slightly ajar, a dark mouth in the pale wood. I remember the feel of the worn cotton socks, the neat, almost pathetic orderliness of his few possessions. And then my fingers brushed against something that wasn't fabric. It was slick, papery. I pulled out a small, folded packet, then another. White powder nestled in a tiny, transparent envelope. The world didn't slow down. It sharpened. The dust motes dancing in the sunbeam from the window, the distant beat of the music, the frantic thumping of my own heart. It all crystallized. My whole body understood before my brain could form the words. This is it. This is the key that unlocks the mystery of our misery. The missed bus passes he blamed on administration errors. The late paychecks, the hush-hush phone calls where he'd turn his back and whisper, I promise. The heavy, dread-filled silence that would descend upon the house for hours before Linda's temper finally broke. It all clicked into place with the cold, final sound of a lock turning. I confronted him that night in the garage, the air thick with the smell of oil and guilt. He was hunched over a carburetor, his hands black with grime. When I held up the little packet, his face didn't register shock, just a weary, defeated resignation. He looked at me through the slats of a half-formed, pathetic smile. It's from a long time ago, Sarah, he stammered, his voice a low rasp. A younger me, stupid mistakes. He reached out a greasy hand, not to take the packet, but as a plea. I love her. You know I do. I can't help it sometimes. It takes the edge off. He said the word a week, like it was a shield, an excuse that absolved him of all responsibility. In that moment, the last vestige of my childhood faith in him curdled and died. I learned that cowardice doesn't always look like running away. Sometimes it looks like a man hiding in a cloud of white powder, letting a monster rampage because he's too frail to face the storm. For 30 years, I kept that secret. I held it in my palm like a tiny burning coal. It warmed me with the promise of future power, and it burned me with a constant, acidic memory of his betrayal. Secrets are strange ovens. You feed them enough pain, enough quiet rage, and they slowly bake a plan. People who haven't lived it imagine revenge as an eruption. A gunshot, a screaming match, a fire. In movies, it's all stolen lovers and fistfights in the rain. But the real art of revenge, the kind that settles in your spine and changes your cellular structure, is slow. It's glacial. Why did I wait 30 years? Because unmanaged fury is wasted energy like shouting into a hurricane. Because timing isn't just everything. It's the only thing. I wasn't just storing anger. I was building an architecture. Every time Linda called me a worthless, I didn't just cry. I mentally filed the date, the time, the exact inflection in her voice, and I wrote it down in a hidden ledger I kept in my mind. That word became a brick. Every time Robert looked away when she berated me in public, that moment of averted gaze became a steel beam. Every small humiliation was a piece of lumber, a bag of cement. I was the architect, and my blueprint was a future built not on spontaneous destruction, but on calculated, meticulous reclamation. Revenge, when done right, is not just about hurting them back. It's about forcing them to stare into the mirror of their own ugliness until they recoil. It's about systematically tearing down every illusion they've ever hidden behind. Respectability, pity, the comforting lie of a normalcy, and leaving them exposed, raw, and utterly alone. When Linda screamed, my ears didn't just hear it. They filled with a thick, hot syrup, muffling the world until all that was left was the high-frequency vibration of her rage. My heart didn't just beat faster. It squeezed itself into a tiny, petrified fist in my throat, choking me. I learned to speak in small, monosyllabic words, to make my body compact, to not take up space with my voice or my presence. At school, I was a ghost. I wrote long, rambling letters to imaginary friends who lived in castles made of silence. I drew houses in the margins of my notebooks. They never had doors, only windows. My teacher once asked me why. I looked up, my 13-year-old eyes already old, and said, "You can always look out, Miss Higgins, but you can't always leave." There were nights I'd pack a small bag, a toothbrush, a spare pair of socks, an apple I'd saved from lunch. I'd sit on the edge of my bed, poised for flight, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. But my feet would feel like they were cast in concrete. The fear of the unknown was a more terrifying monster than the one I knew. So I'd unpack the bag, hide the apple, and practice stillness until it became a muscle I could flex on command. I practiced smiling in the mirror, a tight, bloodless stretching of lips, until it was a reflex I could deploy like a shield. I got my first job at 14, cleaning tables at a cafe. The money was a pittance, but it was mine. It was the first thing that truly belonged to me that Linda couldn't taint or control. I left home the day I turned 18 with 200 pounds and a suitcase full of silence. I learned to make money talk, to make it say, I am someone, when the house at 47 Willow Road had screamed you were nothing for so long. I studied people's faces, their micro-expressions, searching for a flicker of kindness, a potential refuge. But true refuge is a rare currency. So I did what all survivors do in the end. I adapted. I became a chameleon, blending into the background. All the while, my inner world was a forge, hammering my pain into a weapon of exquisite patience. Let me bring them into sharper focus for you, Linda. She was always cleverer with words than with affection. The physical blows were almost a relief compared to the psychological flaying. She didn't just hit. She insulted with the precision of a master fencer. She didn't just steal my childhood. She gaslit me about its very existence. I remember one specific Saturday. I was 15. I had accidentally used the last of the milk for my cereal. A simple, mundane mistake. Linda turned it into a public seminar on my inherent moral rot. Mrs. Gable from next door was over for tea. Linda stood at the kitchen sink, washing a cup, her back to us, and her voice, calm and cutting, filled the room. It's the selfishness, you see, Eleanor, she said to Mrs. Gable, not even using my name. It's a deep-seated character flaw. She doesn't think of anyone but herself. It's in the little things. The milk today, my best lipstick last week. It's a pattern. A spiritual carelessness. I sat there frozen, my cereal turning to soggy cement in the bowl. Mrs. Gable nodded politely, her eyes darting towards me with a mixture of pity and discomfort, before quickly looking away. They always looked away. Robert, who had witnessed the whole thing, said nothing. That night, he slipped a packet of chocolate biscuits onto my bed, as if a cheap sugar hit could stanch the bleeding from 1,000 tiny cuts. Robert's loyalty was a pitiful, fragile thing. He was the kind of man who would spend 3 hours meticulously repacking the wheel bearings on a city bus, ensuring the safety of 60 strangers, and then come home and pour a bottle of whiskey over the screaming dysfunction of his own home. He would tell me he loved me, his voice slurry with drink, but it always carried the silent, screaming caveat. But not enough to risk anything. Not enough to stand between you and her. Not enough to be a man. You learn to catalog people like that, the abusers, the enablers, the mute, complicit crowd on the street. You become a student of human fracture lines. You learn to spot the exact point where the foundation of a person's life is weakest. And you learn in the quiet, precise mathematics of long-held grief exactly where to apply pressure. I was not reckless. I bought time with my silence. While other university students were out partying, I was in the library, but not for my literature degree. I was in the law section, studying the dry, dusty texts about licensing regulations, welfare fraud, and public service employment law. I learned how large institutions, with their endless hunger for neat records and tidy narratives, despised messy reputations. I learned how a single, anonymous complaint, backed by the right document, filed at the right time, could start an avalanche. But you don't start an avalanche in the summer. You wait for winter. You wait for the perfect conditions. So I began to gather small, hard facts, like collecting smooth cold stones I would one day throw. A photocopy of a falsified payslip I found in Robert's old jacket. A bus schedule with his name on it, noting the times he was often unwell. A neighbor's casual, offhand testimony about seeing him a bit worse for wear before his shift, written down in my neat, unassuming handwriting and stored in a safety deposit box. I collected these things not with frenzy, but with the obsessive, quiet patience of an archivist. To any outsider, it would have looked like nothing. To me, it was an arsenal. There was one specific night, a year after I'd moved out. I was 19, thinking I was free, but the umbilical cord of trauma is long and strong. I had come back to collect some old books, a foolish, sentimental notion. The house was the same. The smell was the same. Linda came in late, her cheeks flushed, smelling of someone else's perfume and the smug, cloying satisfaction of someone who has gotten exactly what they want. She saw me in the hallway and her eyes, those cold, assessing eyes, lit up with a familiar malice. She didn't shout. She stepped close, so close I could smell the gin on her breath, and she whispered. Her voice was a hungry, puckered thing slithering into my ear. "You look tired, Sarah. Drawn. You'll never be anything, you know. You have that desperate look about you. The kind of stupid that no amount of education can fix. You will always be nothing. You were born nothing and you'll die nothing." It was small. It was petty. It was a line she'd used 100 times before. But that night, something different happened. Instead of the words washing over me, leaving their usual acid burn, something inside me cracked. Not like a twig, but like an overcooked bone, a clean, final, decisive snap. The thing I had been feeding for 6 years, the anger, the shame, the meticulously kept ledger of every taken thing, suddenly shifted. It was no longer a private burning furnace of pain. It morphed in that single instant to a tool, a weapon I had been unconsciously forging all along. I didn't cry. I though. I didn't flinch. I looked right back at her, and for the first time, I didn't see a monster. I saw a target. That night, back in my tiny bedstead, I made a promise out loud. I spoke it to the peeling wallpaper and the single bare light bulb, so the memory of it would be imprinted not just in my mind, but in the very air of the room. My voice steady and cold, I will make him see. I will make him watch it all fall down. I didn't say her name. I didn't say his. I didn't need to. The plan, now fully formed, was mine and mine alone. The first real tangible move happened years later, but its foundation was a late-night phone call. I was 27. An old, distant cousin of Robert's, a man named Arthur who'd never liked Linda, called me. His voice was a gravelly whisper on the line. "Saw your stepdad down by the docks, Sarah." Staggering he was. Not drunk, not properly. Something else. Shaky, dropped his wallet. I picked it up for him and, well, a few of those little white packets fell out. The kind you don't get from a chemist. My heart didn't race with panic. It beat a slow, steady, triumphant drum. I breathed the information in, deep and slow, like a cartographer finding the final, missing piece of a map. I didn't call the police. I didn't confront Robert. I stored Arthur's name, his number, the exact date and time. I began to set up small, casual meetings with him, leaving cups of sweet tea in his hands, smiling the gentle, concerned smile of a loving stepdaughter. That's the invisible, patient labor of true revenge. It looks for all the world like a normal, mundane life. When the time came to act, it would need corroboration. It would need a chorus of voices, all singing the same damning tune. So I prepared. I made polite, unassuming friends with a few indifferent clerks at the local council office. I volunteered to help an elderly neighbor, Mrs. Davenport, with her confusing pension paperwork, and in doing so, I learned exactly how they stamped, filed, and processed official documents. I learned the language of bureaucracy, what they sniffed out with the keen nose of a bloodhound, and what they ignored with the bland eyes of a civil servant. I don't tell you this story to brag. I tell it to show you the anatomy of waiting. I tell it to show you how a human heart, when subjected to enough pressure, can be transformed not into a diamond, but into a scalpel. There will be people who hear this and think I am monstrous. They will ask, with their soft, comfortable morals, why I didn't do something sooner, why I didn't forgive and move on. I will tell them, I did it when the damage would be meaningful. I did it when a single push would topple the entire rotten structure. So here is where I stop for now. For 30 years, the house at 47 Willow Road continued to operate. A slow, grinding clock, its hands moving through the years, its wounds collecting dust. And then, last year, I took one small, perfectly ordinary action that nobody noticed in the messy, distracted light of daily life. I filled out a form. A simple beige form from the Public Transport Authority regarding employee conduct. I attached a single damning photocopy. I pressed send. They thought they had won. They forgot what they did to me. They slept the deep, untroubled sleep of the willfully blind. They paid their bills. They laughed with their hollow, performative laughter. They were about to find out what it feels like when the scaffolding that has supported your entire life is quietly, methodically, unscrewed and removed. And when the house that protected the monster finally collapses, crushing them both in the rubble, they will know it was my doing. Next time, I'll tell you what happened when a license, a ledger, and a single, anonymous complaint were set in motion. How a man who never stood up for anything in his life found himself lying on the ground, the world suddenly, terrifyingly loud. How a woman who cheated a child of her name watched her world shrink and shrink and shrink until there was nowhere left to hide. When you wait 30 years, action feels obscene at first, almost vulgar. All that patience, all those quiet preparations become a part of your DNA. And suddenly your hands are doing something ordinary. Writing on a form, sliding a paper into a photocopier, the green light scanning back and forth like a mechanical eye. Your index finger hovers over the mouse button. That ordinary act turns into a weapon. You almost don't notice how loud the world becomes in the silence that follows. I remember the night before I hit send like a movie freeze frame. Rain tapped a frantic, familiar Morse code against my window. The same rhythm that used to make me flinch when the house at Willow Road would shake with someone else's temper. On my small, neat desk, a cup of tea had gone cold, a gray skin forming on its surface. Spread around it was my arsenal, laid out not with anger, but with the calm reverence of a priest preparing a sacrament. Hospital slip from when I was 7. The word a spiral fracture typed neatly next to a cause, accidental fall. A neighbor's handwritten note, the script shaky with age and fear, describing the aloud arguments and sounds of distress, and the centerpiece, a faded Polaroid of my leg in a cast, my small, pale face looking out from the edge of the frame, a smudged hospital stamp across the bottom corner. Each piece of paper had weight. Each was a voice I had stolen back from the past. My hands trembled not with fear, but with the sheer magnitude of the moment. I whispered to the empty room, to the small, watchful ghosts of my childhood self that I knew were hovering in the corners. This is for you. Brixen, I didn't waste the whisper on Linda or Robert. They would never understand the dignity of small, deliberate things. They only understood noise. That night, I made a preparatory call to the Public Transport Authority's anonymous tip line. The voice on the other end was a woman's bored nasal. She did not care about my childhood. She wanted a name, a date, a registration number. She wanted proof. And what is the nature of your complaint? She droned. I took a slow breath. I have reason to believe that Robert Mitchell, I said, my voice flat and clean as a scalpel, is operating public transport vehicles while under the influence of a controlled substance. I have documentation to support this. I gave her the details. I was not pleading. I was cataloging. The clerk's voice remained polite, disinterested, like a blade wrapped in velvet. We'll look into it, she said. It may take some time. I have time, I said, and hung up. The click of the receiver was the loudest sound I'd ever heard. When I pressed send the next day, it felt like a legal prayer. The email left my outbox and moved through the digital ether like a silent, patient missile. It didn't explode then, it only traveled. But once you launch a truth into systems that run on rules and reputations, the machine begins to hum. Small bureaucracies have the power to shred illusions. They do it in triplicate forms, in official revocations, in the quiet, bloodless language of policy. And when they move, the world notices. 3 days later, there was a knock at their door. Not the frantic hammering of a debt collector, not the lazy tap of a neighbor. This was a polite, firm civil knock. The sound of consequence dressed in a uniform. I was in Mrs. Davenport's garden 2 houses down, ostensibly helping her prune her roses. My secateurs snipped a stem, the sound crisp in the quiet morning. My eyes, however, were locked on the front door of number 47. Robert opened it, blinking in the morning light like a mole pushed from its burrow. He was in his vest, his hair mussed from sleep. The man on the doorstep was in a crisp, dark blue uniform, a folder tucked under his arm. He had the impassive face of someone who deals in other people's ruin before lunch. Robert Mitchell, his voice was dry, devoid of emotion. Robert nodded, that wet, involuntary smile already twitching on his lips, the smile of a man who has spent his life believing the world is a series of misunderstandings that can be laughed away. The uniformed man read from a piece of paper. We've received a complaint. An investigation has been opened regarding your conduct and fitness to hold a public service vehicle license. The smile slid off Robert's face like something heavy dropped from a table. Linda appeared behind him, wrapped in her floral robe, a queen witnessing the first breach of her castle walls. Her face was a mask of thin paint over bone, but her eyes were darting, alive with a sudden feral panic. The man asked if he could come inside. Robert just stood aside, his body language that of a door swinging open on broken hinges. Inside, I knew Robert would be trying to laugh it off. "It's a mistake, surely," he'd say, his voice thick with a lie. "My wife, she must have someone with a grudge." Linda would be trying to control the moment, to use that slow, commanding voice that had cowed shop assistants and social workers for decades. But there was a paper. There was a record. There were questions being asked in a language that did not bend to charm or threat. That night, for the first time I could ever recall, Robert didn't sleep. He sat in his armchair, a glass of amber liquid in his hand. The ice long melted. He drank until he passed out, the glass still clutched in his fist, the evidence of his habit catching the lamplight like a confession. The man who had once believed alcohol could smooth over anything now realized, with a dawning horror, that there were some cracks it could not fill. The house was quieter in the mornings, as if the walls themselves were leaning inward, listening for the next blow to fall. People's reputations are the most fragile of ecosystems. They live in the moist, warm petri dishes of gossip, in the typed records of HR departments, in the quiet, scribbled notes on a manager's desk. Once you place a single, credible crack into that ecosystem, it spreads like mycelium, invisible, until it fruits into a forest of doubt. The call from the bus depot came 2 weeks later. I was in my flat and my own phone rang. It was Arthur, Robert's cousin. His voice was a low, excited rumble. "They've suspended him, Sarah." "Sent him home?" "Pending further review," they said. "Full pay, but his keys, his ID, everything." Handed it over just like that. I thanked him, my voice calm, and hung up. I did not cheer. I did not pump my fist. I walked to my window and looked out at the city, my breath fogging the cool glass. A strange cocktail of emotions stirred in my gut. Vindication, a sharp, bright sliver of triumph, and underneath it, something darker, heavier, the first taste of ash. I went to the supermarket that evening, timing my trip for when I knew they would be there, doing their weekly shop. I saw them at the end of the canned goods aisle. Robert looked shrunken, his shoulders slumped as if the suspension letter had physically weighed him down. He was staring at a can of soup, as if he couldn't read the label. Linda's posture was ramrod straight, a brutal caricature of dignity, but her hand as she gripped the shopping cart was white-knuckled and trembling. A woman from their street, a Mrs. Hemingway, passed them. A few months ago, she would have stopped for a chat. Today, she gave a tight, brief nod and hurried her cart past, her eyes fixed straight ahead. The first public shunning, a small thing, a stone, but stones build avalanches. I watched as Robert's eyes tracked Mrs. Hemingway's retreating back. I saw the moment the understanding dawned in his dull, confused gaze. This wasn't a private shame. It was public knowledge. The world was watching, and it was turning its face away. He looked down at his own hands, as if seeing them for the first time, and I saw them shake. Not from withdrawal, but from a raw, undiluted fear. The scaffolding was groaning. Linda was not built for powerlessness. Denial was her native language, and she now wove it into a suit of armor. I heard from another neighbor, a small, bird-like woman named Carol who I'd always buy a coffee for, that Linda was on the warpath. "She was in the post office. Sarah," Carol whispered, leaning in conspiratorially, telling anyone who'd listen that it was a targeted campaign of harassment. "She said you were she said you were unstable. That you'd always been jealous of their happiness." I just smiled. "Let her talk, Carol. The truth has a way of coming out." And it did. Linda's charm offensive quickly morphed into a threat campaign. She started making long-distance calls to old friends who had influence. She tried to bribe a clerk at the transport authority with a bottle of expensive whiskey, a move I'd anticipated, and which was now noted in his official log. She was playing the only games she knew, intimidation and manipulation, but she was playing it against a system that was immune to her particular brand of poison. The more she fought, the more desperate she appeared. The more desperate she appeared, the more people doubted her. The queen of cruelty was finding her kingdom had become a republic, and no one was heeding her decrees. The final straw in this phase was Matthew, Robert's brother. I had, months before, seeded a tiny doubt in his ear over a polite lunch. "I'm just worried about Robert," I'd said, my eyes wide with faux concern. "He seems so fragile lately. And with his job being so safety critical, Matthew, a man whose morality was as flexible as his bank balance, now saw the suspension not as a family tragedy, but as a liability. He came to the house, not with support, but with a lawyer's cold eye. "How long has this been going on, Robert?" he asked, his voice devoid of brotherly warmth. "At this habit of yours. You put people's lives at risk. My family's name. I heard about this from Arthur, who heard it from Matthew's wife." The conversation had apparently descended into a screaming match, with Linda accusing Matthew of betrayal, and Robert sitting silently, a monument to shame. The family, the last bastion of forced loyalty, was fracturing from the inside out. The fissures were becoming chasms. Paper is patient. Paper is cruel. It does not scream, it does not threaten. It just arrives in crisp white envelopes, each one a little heavier than the last. A final warning from the mortgage company, the word "off foreclosure" lurking in the small print. A red-stamped notice from the council about overdue taxes. He just sat down in his armchair, the one that had molded itself to the shape of his cowardice over 40 years, and stared at his hands. They were mechanics' hands, strong, capable of rebuilding an engine, yet they had never been strong enough to build a safe home for a child. Now, they were useless. He sat there for hours, not moving, not speaking, as the afternoon light faded into evening. Linda ranted around him, a tornado of blame and fury, but he was already in a place her words could no longer reach. That was the day Robert stopped fighting. The day the last ember of whatever fight he'd ever had was extinguished. He was just waiting. For 30 years, those medical records had been my hidden arsenal. They were not memories, they were facts, stamped and signed by impartial authorities. The records of a broken wrist at age 7. The report citing an unlikely fall pattern. The ER slip from when I was 11. Suspected neglect is scribbled in the margin by a harried doctor. The x-rays that showed the faint white lines of old, healed fractures, a history of violence written in the secret language of bone. I did not forge, I did not embellish, I only revealed. I had packaged them with the cool precision of an archivist sending a priceless manuscript to a museum. I delivered them to the Transport Authority's legal department not with a scream, but with a silence that was more deafening than any accusation. Bureaucracies respect silence. It makes them lean in. It makes them listen. When those records were presented as evidence in the final closed-door hearing, there was no arguing with them. You can't charm an x-ray. You can't gaslight a hospital stamp. Robert tried. He sputtered, he denied. He claimed the records were exaggerated, taken out of context, that I was a manipulative, troubled child. But there were too many dates, too many signatures, too many truths stacked one upon the other like bricks in a wall, and he was on the wrong side of it. The most devastating moment came when the chairman of the disciplinary board, a stern-faced man in his 60s, held up the Polaroid of my broken leg. He looked from the photo to Robert, his expression unreadable. "Mr. Mitchell," he said, his voice echoing in the quiet room. "This child's leg was broken. The official record, which you co-signed, says it was an accident. Do you maintain that position?" Robert opened his mouth. Nothing came out. He looked at Linda, who was staring straight ahead, her jaw a hard line. He looked back at the photo, at the small, pale face of the girl he had failed. And he crumbled. His shoulders slumped, and he gave a single jerky nod. It wasn't an admission of guilt. It was a surrender. In that moment, Linda did not look at him with pity, or even with shared shame. She looked at him with a pure, cold disgust. The shield had not only failed, it had become a liability. The enabler was no longer useful. The partnership was broken. She turned her fury inward towards him, and I saw the last bond between them snap. Debt is a quiet predator, but it eats fast. The red-stamped mortgage notice became a foreclosure warning. The bills became final demands. The phone rang with the relentless, impersonal rhythm of automated dialers from collection agencies. The house at 47 Willow Road began to visibly die. The lawn, once Linda's pride and joy, grew wild and tangled. A gutter came loose and hung from the roof like a broken limb. The paint on the front door cracked and blistered. It no longer looked like a home. It looked like a warning. The neighborhood, once willfully blind, now watched with a morbid, unblinking curiosity. Children were subtly steered to the other side of the street by their parents. The once polite nods Linda received were now replaced by averted gazes, or worse, stares of open judgment. The fortress of their respectability was now a glass house, and everyone was watching it shatter. Robert became a ghost. He spent his days in a fugue state, wandering from room to room or sitting on the porch, a bottle his only companion. His hands, those once capable hands, now had a permanent fine tremor. One morning I drove past and saw him staring into the middle distance, his eyes empty. A bus, a number 17, the route he used to maintain, rumbled past. He didn't even flinch, he was already gone. Linda, in her floral robe, still performed the morning ritual of standing in the doorway as if daring the world to defy her, but the performance was hollow. Her eyes, once so sharp and assessing, were now darting, restless, frightened. The queen had lost her crown, and the mob was at the gates. It wasn't a confrontation of shouting. It was quieter and far more deadly. I decided it was time. Silence had been my weapon, but now it was time for a single calculated sound. I requested a meeting with them at my flat. The power dynamic had irrevocably shifted. They arrived looking like refugees from their own lives. Robert seemed to have aged 20 years in as many weeks. Linda's expensive clothes hung loosely on her frame, and her makeup was applied with a less steady hand. I didn't offer them tea. I simply stood there. Why? Robert finally croaked, his voice ruined by whiskey and regret. Why would you do this, Sarah? After everything, after we took you in, I didn't look at him. I looked at Linda. You once told me I would always be nothing, I said, my voice perfectly level. You were wrong. I became an architect. I spent 30 years drawing the blueprints for this moment. And you, I let my gaze sweep over their broken forms. You were the willing contractors of your own destruction. Linda's mask finally broke. You vindictive little bitch, she spat, taking a step towards me. But the old magic was gone. The command in her voice was now just a shrill, desperate noise. No, Linda, I said so quietly she had to stop to hear me. I'm not the little girl in the Polaroid anymore. You can't hurt me, but look around. Look at him. I gestured to Robert, a hollowed-out shell in the chair. You spent your life building a kingdom on a foundation of fear and silence. I just showed the world the cracks. You did the rest yourselves. There was no grand revelation, no tearful apology. There was only the stark, ugly truth of the ruin they had cultivated. Robert began to cry, silent, hopeless tears that carved canyons through the grime on his face. Linda just stood there, her fists clenched, utterly defeated. They left without another word. There was nothing left to say. A month later, the bank took possession of 47 Willow Road. They were evicted. I heard through the gossip chain that they moved into a cramped, damp bedsit on the other side of town, living on state benefits. The house that had been a mouth that consumed my childhood was now just an empty, silent shell. I am 57 years old. I stand now at the edge of the quiet forest behind where their house once stood. It was torn down to make way for a new development. There is nothing left. No trace of the pain, no echo of the screams, just grass and the whisper of the wind through the trees. I thought revenge would be the loudest moment of my life. I thought it would be a symphony of crashing beams and shattering glass. But it wasn't. The loudest moment was the silence that came after. The silence in my own flat, a silence I owned that was not fraught with dread. The silence where their voices used to be in my head, screaming that I was nothing. The silence of their ruined lives, a silence I had orchestrated with the patience of a lifetime. I did not feel the triumphant joy I had imagined. I felt quiet, a deep, profound, and weary quiet. The ghost that had lived inside me for 43 years had finally been laid to rest. Revenge didn't heal me. It didn't give me back my childhood. But it did something else, something crucial. It returned my voice. It proved that the small, terrified girl in the Polaroid was not powerless. She was just waiting, and her silence in the end was more powerful than all their noise. The lesson is not that revenge is sweet. It's that survival is a long, hard road, and sometimes justice is not a gift given by the world, but a structure you have to build yourself, brick by painful brick, over 30 long years. And when the last brick is laid and the structure is complete, the only sound you will hear is the sound of your own freedom. and it is the most beautiful sound in the world, and it is enough.